Well, thanks, Hilary, and thank you all for coming. Does it sound okay?
Yeah.
Yep. And particularly thank you to Dr. Helen Sykes for making this occasion possible. But as Hilary says, we will have more on that later. In the decades since the second wave of feminism in the 1970s, there was a stirring of a rape law reform agenda that achieved many positive things, in particular improving victim rights, survivor rights. I suppose as a bit player, serving on law reform commissions and committees and so on during the latter decades of the 20th century when so much of that rape law reform occurred, it's on the other hand hard to look back on it as having changed the game in any fundamental way. Has it made a large difference in protecting people from rape? Not directly is my argument, but indirectly very much so. So this was an important review essay of 90 empirical studies from 5 English-speaking countries of rape and attempted rape by Cathy Daly and our own Brigitte Bouot. They found that on average across those 90 studies, 86% of victims don't report their rape to the police. That figure was 87% for Australia, so Australia pretty similar to the situation in the rest of the English-speaking world. For Australia, rapes of reporting to the police have increased somewhat in recent decades, while conviction rates have actually fallen a bit. Now let's look at this data from the perspective of a rational rapist who's weighing up the chances that he or she will get away with rape. So 14%, 13% in Australia actually get reported to the police. Of that 14%, only 30% are then referred by the police for prosecutions. This is across, adding the data together from these 90 studies. A third of those cases are then dropped by the prosecutor. More than a third of those that are prosecuted result in a finding of not guilty of any offence. Of those who are found guilty of an offence, for a third of them, it's for a lesser offence than that charged, and often much lesser offence than that which the victim originally complained of. And then for only 57% of those who are then convicted of some offence is the sentence to a term of imprisonment. And Cathy Daly's work, she like me has this interest in restorative justice as an alternative, so part of her work has been to show empirically in South Australia where at least for juvenile rape offenders it is possible to go to restorative justice conferences. And one of her important empirical findings is that in cases that go the conventional route and go to end up in the courtroom, there's a huge amount of charging down, but very little charging down in cases that go to restorative justice. So that's one of the arguments for restorative justice in these cases, even though the punishment might not be severe, as what I'm articulating is as a very low prospect of imprisonment through going the court route. At least the conversation is about the allegation that was actually made initially by the victim in the restorative justice process. And this is a rather important concern in Cathy Daly's work, because she found in her data cases that had been charged down to things like indecent exposure, and many cases of rape that were charged down to sexual assault and other lesser offences. If we look overall at that pattern across the 90 empirical studies, looking at countries like Australia, the US, the UK, that have some of the best funded criminal justice systems in the world, if we believe we've been a victim of sexual assault, indeed if we believe we've been a victim of rape or attempted rape, there's far less than a 1 in 100 probability that someone will go to jail for that sexual offence, and less than a 1 in 100 chance that the alleged offender will go to jail for any even lesser offence. So is our hope to reduce rape in future by further increasing the odds of prison up to that 1 in 100 probability to reach the goal of a 1 in 100 probability articulated in those terms? We'd have to be pretty optimistic about the efficacy of deterrence to think that that would be a game changer. And of course, we criminologists are not very optimistic that changing deterrence at the margin makes a big effect, has a big effect on crime rates. That said, the theory of rape prevention I now want to develop does depend on preventing the odds of conviction slipping to zero. So, you know, perhaps one might look back and say, well, that may be precisely what would have happened if there hadn't been the rape law reform that had occurred. We need, I'll be arguing, we need to be convicting some significant number of rapists to underwrite the shamefulness of the crime of rape. But the increasing deterrence at the margin is not the fundamental way that the criminal law prevents crime. My argument, starting in my work in the 1980s on shame and criminal justice, is that the criminal law mainly prevents crime by rendering crime unthinkable. So, you know, last week, probably all sorts of work colleagues, members of our families did terrible things to us that made us extremely aggravated and agitated about those wrongs that they had done to us. Now, I hope that most of us did not contemplate murdering that person as the way of resolving that problem. But the way the criminal law that prohibits homicide works is not primarily by people thinking about what are the odds of this happening to me or that happening to me if I get that person out of the way so that they'll never do that terrible thing to me again. Rather, homicide has been put right off our deliberative agenda. It's so unthinkable to us that we don't even consider it as an option, as I say, hopefully for the folk in this room. So in those days when I was doing a lot of speaking on the role of shame in criminal justice, I would talk about Ross Hommel's work on drink driving, for example, and the kind of interpretation I was wanting to put on that work, that's an example of something that, you know, when I was a kid, getting drunk and driving the car with one's mates was not a shameful kind of activity. For my children, that is not the case. They think in a very different way about the wrongfulness of it, and I think Ross Hommel's work shows how that happened. It didn't happen through a pure deterrence strategy of random breath tests. The random breath tests became the occasion for a communication campaign with the Australian people. Some of you may be old enough to remember those advertisements. Be a mate, offer to drive your mate home when they've had too much to drink. That is the norms of Australian drinking culture changed, and drinking and driving a car is something that we came to feel was very much the wrong sort of thing to do, and also the wrong thing to do to not intervene when there's an opportunity to save the life of a friend who's going to drive. So there's attitude survey evidence indicating that those attitudes did change in those areas, and that indeed thousands of lives have been saved on our roads. You know, it's been much harder to reach that kind of conclusion in respect of rape. But what I argued at the same time as I was arguing about that more than 20 years ago was that, look, if this theory is right, the women's movement, in arguing for rape law reform, is going to have a transformative effect on how societies such as Australian societies think about rape. So that if the women's movement can be successful in having us see the shamefulness of rape through more feminist eyes, then that should make a real difference. Stephen Pinker, in his recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, indeed argues that that's what's happened in the United States. So here's some data. This is an attitude to women's scale. So attitudes to women have become less dominating in this period of history since 1970, the period corresponding to the second wave of feminism. These attitude items are things like supporting the obey clause in the marriage vows, supporting attitude statements like women should worry less about their rights and more about becoming good wives and mothers. So yes, that attitude has changed, and attitudes on that more specifically connect to violence and domination in relationships have also changed in a positive way. And indeed, as many of us know, the crime rate has reduced, and the reduction in homicide has been very strong. It's been much talked about as being as a result of better policing practices and so on. But my argument is that we also need to think about the homicide decline, and not only in the United States but in a number of other countries, through this lens of thinking, well, what comprises the homicide rate? Well, there's an awful lot of husbands killing wives in this data. So that is part of the story. And the second part of the story that Pinker is drawing attention to is that incidents of rape have declined even more steeply. Now, evidence of that kind is, you know, it's not causally strong. There's just an association, but we're at least in a situation now where there was a prediction out there, and the prediction has come true, rather than being utterly refuted. And I would argue that it's also come true in some other offences such as drink driving. Assaults by intimate partners in the United States. This is based on victim survey data. The female victimisation has also come down, and some would argue that these are better quality kinds of data because it doesn't depend on bias in the justice system. It's sort of asking the same kind of survey question. Unfortunately, the Australian data is, you know, it's pretty hard I mean, someone should try to do it, but I'm reluctant to interpret the Australian data as strong enough for this kind of analysis. But Pinker, the second thing to say is that just in the last few weeks there's data being issued by the US government showing that in the past few years this has dropped again. So there's been further progress here. And Pinker interprets the British data, which is significantly more robust than the Australian data, as also fitting this this pattern. Now I want to shift focus to how we transfer feminist social movement politics into institutional politics. And I'll start with a very micro institution of the high school. And many of you will not be surprised that it's a restorative justice story that I start with. So in the early days of our innovation with restorative justice here in Australia, more than 20 years ago, in a New South Wales country town west of here, there was an incident in a high school swimming pool where a sexual assault did occur. It occurred without people seeing it because it occurred underwater in the swimming pool, but it became a very traumatic incident for the girl involved in the incident. And this was particularly because the boy involved in this high school had gone around bragging to his mates that he had accomplished this feat of fondling underwater. And everyone in the school knew the story. It became an issue with the principal of the school, and they decided to have a restorative justice conference. The father of the boy came along with a very boys will be boys attitude to what had happened. It was just a bit of innocent horseplay in the swimming pool. But when the supporters of the teenage girl, her girlfriends from the school, really engaged the debate in that restorative justice conference, their story was a very different one. They're saying, you know, you saying that, Mr. So-and-so, that's precisely the problem here, that what people are saying about our friend is that she asked for this, and that is absolutely not the case. And we are going to have a conversation in this meeting of a fairly broad-based electorate of the school, if you like, of parents, of teachers, and of kids in this aspect of the age spectrum of the school, that in the end did lead to the father believing that it was wrong. He had been wrong to think that this was innocent horseplay, and this girl was very badly affected by what had happened. And also the boys' supporters in a restorative justice conference. It's a different setup from the courtroom. In a courtroom, you invite into the room those who can inflict maximum damage on the other side. In a restorative justice conference, you're inviting into the room those who can provide maximum support to your own side, be it the victim side or the alleged perpetrator side. So the boys who went in as supporters of the alleged perpetrator of the sexual assault also changed their view about what had happened. And part of the agreement, their proposal and agreement at the conference say, look, we can understand how the survivor of this incident has been so badly affected by it. What we will undertake to do with the perpetrator is go around the school and say we were wrong to spread that rumour that she had been asking for it, and this was a terrible thing to happen in the culture of the school, and we will lead with the teachers of the school a cultural transformation so that dominating relationships between girls and boys, bragging about sexual conquest and other things that can be very damaging to adolescents will change. And we'll talk about it a lot. And we'll have school meetings that talk about the need to have this kind of institutional, cultural change in our high school. That story doesn't, had a happy ending in terms of the transformation of the high school, but not a happy ending for Senior Sergeant Terry O'Connell, my friend who convened the conference, because I spoke about it on the media. And this got him into enormous trouble. There were various feminist activists who called in, and this was a terrible thing to do, and he was called up to Sydney and carpeted over why it was a very wrong thing for him to do. I think now, with the greater evidence base we have on restorative justice, that's something that wouldn't quite happen in that way. And now that there's been the South Australian experience that's been evaluated, and other data showing, including data here in Canberra, showing that it's with actually more serious violent offences that restorative justice makes more difference in reducing violence, some 40% reduction in reoffending in the violence experiment here in Canberra. That's helped create a different climate today. So my argument is that institutional culture is the important thing. And does that mean that I think that criminal prosecutions are not important? No, they're important too. So think about the defence force. Think about the Catholic Church and the churches more broadly as larger institutions. We need at least occasional criminal prosecutions in those organisations to signify the sanctity of the criminal law as an institution that protects us, to underwrite the shamefulness of sexual assault, if you like. We also need the criminal law of rape at the peak of an enforcement pyramid to motivate institutional transformation at the base of a regulatory pyramid. Indeed, an interesting law reform debate to have would be the one we had a couple of decades ago about convicting corporations for homicide with occupational health and safety offences. Should we be debating whether the Catholic Church in Australia has corporate criminal responsibility for the crime of rape? Whatever the outcome of that kind of debate, it seems to me it'd be a good law reform debate to have, just as it was with occupational health and safety, because it'd be consciousness-raising debate that would heighten the shamefulness of institutional responsibility for rape. And I'll return to the idea of the responsive regulatory pyramid a little later. Now I'll move on to this Holowaka case. It's an Indigenous community, a Cree community in Manitoba, in Canada. There was a concern of the elders of that community that they had a massive alcoholism problem. So they decided to conduct traditional healing circles in a rather restorative style, but more fundamentally in an Indigenous style, to deal with that problem of alcoholism. Their conclusion at the end of that healing circle process that the alcoholism program had a deeper cause, which was sexual violence in the community, particularly sexual violence directed at children. And when more systematic research was subsequently done, it was revealed that a majority of the people living in this community had been sexually assaulted at some time in their lives, mostly when they were children. So they continued with what they thought of was a traditional program for dealing with problems of alcoholism, to deal with these sexual assault issues, and they secured formal admissions. Local prosecutors started to be engaged with the process, and there was a protocol agreed with the local prosecutors that if they would participate in the process, if they would make full confessions and admit criminal responsibility for their wrongdoing and meet all of the demands that the victims were putting in their way as to what they ought to do, not only for them but for the community, and that was important, I'll come to that in a minute, then they wouldn't have to go to jail. And but the interesting thing is that those who didn't cooperate were sent to the prosecutor, and two were convicted and went to prison. Now actually, and there were more than 50 as of the time that I was up to date on this stuff. I assume there's many over 60 now, but I don't really know in any authoritative way the numbers, who had, you know, by the late 90s, by 1996, there had been 50 who, through the restorative justice process, had admitted to these criminal offences. So that for me, the big accomplishment of Holowaka is in achieving admissions of guilt of sexual abuse of children from more than 1/3 of the adult male population of that whole community. We're talking about a little community of 600 people here. And also bear in mind that 2 of them going to jail in such a tiny community is also a very big number. You know, that's an incident of conviction that the Australian Capital Territory could never hope to accomplish in this area. So that it's wrong to view this empirical experience as some sort of terrible and dire trade-off between one form of restorative justice and traditional punitive justice. What you have going on as a result of it is rather more of both than is the status quo accomplishment. So if we think about the current situation with the Department of Defence, with ADFA, with the Catholic Church, with other churches in Australia, as in Holowaka, there are hundreds of allegations, I guess thousands in the case of the Catholic Church, that would both overwhelm the justice system and overwhelm those institutions if we tried to prosecute criminally every one of them, every one of those hundreds of cases. That would paralyse the performance of the normal functioning of the Department of Defence or the Catholic Church. But it is possible to adopt that Holowaka strategy of marshalling our prosecutorial resources, this is with respect to old historic abuses, for prosecuting those who refuse to confess and engage in a restorative justice process in which everything that's possible to be done for the victim, a victim-centred process to deliver whatever empowered victims believe are important for guaranteeing the future safety of their community or their institutions. Now, I haven't really got time to talk about business organisations, but really, you know, they're not in the public opinion frame at the moment. But the problems of secretiveness in the business community are much more profound than they are in Indigenous communities, in high schools, in the other arenas that we're talking about. Simply in the Commonwealth Public Service, where rape does occur and does come to our attention, where rape victims, and in this town, in the Commonwealth Public Service, are not willing to go to the police about their allegations against their boss in some of the cases that I'm thinking of over the years. They think it's bad for their career, they think it's bad for the esprit de corps of the work group of which they're a part, and so in the business community and the public sector at large, there's a need to move on to those institutions as well, is what I'm arguing, and there may be an even greater, what I'm going to now describe, as an enforcement swamping problem there. But now I'm going to jump to a very different institutional arena where possibly the enforcement swamping problem is at its worst, and that's in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Here's some data. That there have been other studies showing that where the sexual assault definition in the survey is more general, where you get a 44% number victimisation rate here for women and 24% here for men. It's notable that the male rape victimisation rate is very high in the Congo. But if you look at the surveys, it's certainly in terms of war-related rape, it's as bad as it gets in the contemporary world. I'll now talk about a specific incident that occurred in a group of villages around the central village of Luvungi. Luvungi was controlled by a gentleman called Colonel Cheka. He was a sort of a businessman turned militant who made his money out of mines. You know, the coltan that is critical to our laptops, to our iPhones, to etc. All of these devices have coltan. It's a very valuable mineral, but there's also gold, diamonds in this eastern Congo region of Africa. And so the modus operandi of criminalised business groups is to grab control of these mines, often run them on the basis of slave labour in the mines, and then illegally export the minerals out through Rwanda mostly, but also through other neighbouring states. There was some resistance in Luvungi to Colonel Cheka's control and his institutionalisation of slavery in this place. His way of responding to it was to order mass rape in the village. The United Nations has confirmed that in a period of 3 days in 2010, 387 cases of rape occurred, mostly women, but some men and many children. It went on for over 3 days, and most of the victims were found by the UN to have been raped between 2 and 6 occasions, and it was gang rape. Also, the other thing that happened is that 116 people, many of them children, were captured into slavery as a result of this operation against the village. Now, Colonel Cheka had been, like most of the warlords in this part of the country, offered a negotiated settlement to lay down their weapons, to get an amnesty, to join the peace. Many of them joined the Congolese army as part of the deal, or set up a legitimate kind of business. Now, it's easy for us to be cynical about doing those kind of deals with those kind of folks, but we need to bear in mind that there is an enforcement swamping problem big time in play here, because I'm just telling the story of one particular mass rape that in my trip to the Congo earlier this year I was able to make inquiries about, but there have been many of these in very recent years, and many more going back over the past couple of decades, and not a capacity of the Congolese state or the UN, as I'll get to in a moment, to respond. So one of the things that was a bit different about the rapes at Luvungi is that it attracted international attention, and rape investigators were sent from Western countries, very impressive, highly trained ones, and an attempt to arrest Colonel Checker was mounted. Someone had probably tipped him off, because where the intelligence indicated he would be, he had fled, and only one of the 7, I think, that they were targeting to arrest was actually captured in the raid. What happened then was that Colonel Checker's men went back to the village, or sometime later, after testimony. You know, a lot of testimony had been collected from survivors, and threatened them that if they did not recant their testimony, there would be another mass rape in Luvungi. So it's a troubling story in the sense that we sort of go part the way up the enforcement pyramid, and we actually make things worse for people as a result of doing that, if we're not willing to do what's required. I had a conversation with a European general about this, and I said to him, you know, he had served in the Congo during the 2000s, and I said to him, you had such an impossible job, so many tens of thousands of people being killed around you, so many tens of thousands of rapes occurring around you, and you have such a limited capability in terms of the number of police that you have and the number of military you have, even though it's actually the biggest UN peacekeeping mission in the world today. And he surprised me with his answer. He said, well, I don't really think so, John. He said, what you can do, if you're serious about protecting people on your patch, is call people in, call the warlords on your patch in after an incident, often, and say to them, either after an incident or before, if something like that happens again, I know that all of you understand that I don't have the personnel, I don't have the military capability to come after all of you. And that's true. I confess that that's true. But what I do have is the capability to come after the next one of you that does anything like that. And then his argument was that what had happened, and there was evidence that in this region of the country, indeed, after the deployment of the capability that European special forces can deliver to a peacekeeping operation, they're not in Eastern Congo anymore, that can be accomplished. And after a blow-up of violence in 2009, the UN Secretary General asked for more deployment of Western forces, rapid deployment kind of forces that could respond to a case like Luvungi, and no, there was no response from any Western country to deliver that. And I spoke to various Western ambassadors in Democratic Republic of Congo about why that is so, and they all said the same thing. They all said people are exhausted, public opinion is exhausted in our electorates from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and you know, the last thing our politicians want is another engagement of this kind that could go in all sorts of ways. And I would argue with them and say, look, responding to something like Luvungi is not like shutting down the Taliban. You know, Colonel Checker's group is 150 armed people, many of them children. So certainly they can run and be hard to catch and track down, but as soon as a credible military capability arrived on the scene in Luvungi, it would be not a difficult challenge to liberate all of those people from slavery, precisely because they probably would respond by just running. You might not catch them, you might arrest or kill those who fought back and decided to stay before they realised that, unlike in the past, you're now serious about it. So here's the responsive regulatory pyramid idea applied here, and I won't go through it. You can read it for yourself. What's interesting about what's happened here, the criminologists here will be aware of Operation Ceasefire in Boston, and so what these European colonels had discovered, independently of knowing about Operation Ceasefire in Boston, is how that works. It's about the theoretical idea of dynamic concentration of deterrence. So in Operation Ceasefire, they had the same enforcement swamping problem. The gangs were in control of certain areas of Boston. The police could not deploy to deal with all of the drug-related gang violence that was going on. So they called them in and said, we understand that, you understand that, we understand, let's understand each other, but the new thing we want you to understand is that the first gang that uses a gun, that's the gang that we're going to attack. And gang gun homicides went down dramatically as a result of that intervention, at least in the short term. And this is a new meta-analysis of 12 studies with control groups of that kind of focus, what they're calling here focused deterrence strategies. These are the two key theorists of the idea of dynamic concentration of deterrence. And of course, concentrating deterrence at the peak of an enforcement pyramid is an example of dynamic concentration of deterrence. So it's a critique of the way we've thought about deterrence in criminology, including in relation to rape, to say that we have this naive idea that we can change patterns of crime by making some changes in the margin, at the margin, to the passive deterrent threat that you face, to increase the amount of jail time you'll suffer, to increase the probability of detection, conviction, and so on, when that's very difficult, very expensive to do. But more fundamentally, it's passive deterrence rather than the dynamic approach to deterrence that these theorists are saying that deterrence actually can be powerful so long as it's dynamic. And they said, we always knew this, didn't we? You know, that European general discovered it independently, the police in Boston discovered it independently, but the story, we've all seen the Western of the sheriff who has one bullet left in his gun, the lynch mob is coming in to, you know, take the bad guy off and lynch him, and the sheriff with one bullet in his gun says, stop there, the first one of you to step forward dies. And they all mumble and walk away. And these guys theorise why it is that dynamic concentration of deterrence works with that kind of effectiveness. We've also seen it with our work with the Centre for Tax System Integrity on when there's enforcement swamping problems with tax compliance, announcing a shutdown. Okay, so the idea, the basic idea of what an institution like the Defence Force or what the Pope should do or what the Royal Commission should do is maybe to call a press conference at which they make 2 law enforcement promises they could keep, rather than a zero tolerance promise that they can't keep. One would be a guarantee of referral to the police for any old case of abuse where, say, the Defence Force or the church is convinced that criminal abuse is a significant possibility, and where that old perpetrator refuses to cooperate at a restorative justice process. The second would be an announcement in the press conference of an iron guarantee that from today, any case where an internal defence inquiry concludes that beyond reasonable, balance of probabilities this has occurred, then a prosecutorial response would occur, and that might be a different one for more senior people than different tests for more junior people. So my theory, now based on a good bit of criminological evidence, is that announcement effects are important. In effect, the message can be sent to criminals that we don't have the resources to deal with every case, but we can deal with every new one that comes up, and that really can be delivered. And with every old one, where you don't cooperate with supporting victims by being truthful, we also have the resources to target you criminally. So part of the cultural transformation in the midst of all of that is embracing a new culture of victim support. So ship by ship in the military, regiment by regiment, just as transformation in the New South education system can occur high school by high school, so it can occur in the Anglican Church, parish by parish, order by order, and then institution by institution, and only then does the enforcement swamping challenge become manageable, but it can become manageable. So my proposition is that the Gillard government is taking us on a journey with promise for a long march through the institutions, starting with defence and then moving on to the churches and others, to transform cultures of abuse. So we take the next steps on the path to transformation that the women's movement has started us on, ship by ship, regiment by regiment, school by school, in that way, and thereby we also transform ourselves into a society that suffers less from all forms of bullying and all forms of domination. We don't get there by prosecuting every crime we see. We do get there by sticking with the challenge of institutional transformation until institutions are actually transformed, continuing to escalate our response against an institution that's been sweeping the problem under the carpet, and escalating again and again up a regulatory pyramid as needed until it does fix the problem, until every future sexual assault is institutionally confronted at the local level at the moment when it occurs. And then we can have a society where sexual assault is as unthinkable as murder, and we bequeath to our children the future justice of a low rate of sexual assault that should be the birthright of our children. Thank you.